There is a particular kind of silence that spreads through a room full of powerful people the moment they realize they have badly, catastrophically misjudged an opponent. It doesn't arrive with shouting. It arrives quietly, one uncomfortable glance at a time, as delegate after delegate slowly stops defending a position they were absolutely certain of 5 minutes earlier. That silence fell over the Velkarn Imperium's ruling council on the exact day their supreme commander stood before them and admitted, in front of the entire chamber, that the single warning he'd once mocked as an empty diplomatic gesture had actually been the last polite thing anyone in this galaxy would ever say to him. For 200 years, the Velkarn Imperium had never lost a war it chose to start. It had swallowed 400 star systems, crushed every uprising within months, and treated mercy as a weakness reserved for civilizations too soft to survive contact with a real empire. Then it demanded Earth's surrender, on the same casual terms it had used against every other planet it had ever conquered. Humanity answered with a single sentence and no further explanation, and what followed over the next 11 months wasn't a battle. It was a lesson, delivered piece by piece, about exactly what happens when the most patient species in the galaxy finally runs out of patience. By the time this story ends, you will understand precisely why that one warning was never a bluff, and why some silences really do mean exactly what they sound like they mean. For nearly 3 centuries, the galaxy had been at war in one corner or another. Entire star systems burned in disputes nobody outside them fully understood. Ancient civilizations rose, expanded, and eventually collapsed beneath the endless churn of shifting alliances and broken treaties. Through all of it, one civilization remained strangely, stubbornly silent. Humanity. Earth had joined the wider galactic community nearly 200 years earlier. In that time, humans had developed formidable fleets, an economy that expanded steadily across a growing network of colonies, and a technological base that, by every measurable standard, should have made them one of the region's dominant powers. But they didn't behave like one. When wars broke out among their neighbors, Earth offered humanitarian aid rather than alliances. When refugees fled burning worlds, human colonies opened their borders without hesitation. When starving outposts sent desperate calls for help, Earth's supply convoys arrived, quietly and without fanfare. But whenever anyone requested military assistance, the answer was, without exception, the same. No. The wider galaxy found this deeply, persistently frustrating. Many interpreted human neutrality as simple weakness. Others viewed it as outright cowardice. A few genuinely believed humanity simply lacked the stomach for real conflict, since nobody had ever actually witnessed Earth's true military capability in open combat. Human warships rarely ventured beyond their own territory. Human soldiers almost never appeared in anyone else's war. Even their military budgets, as far as any outside observer could determine, seemed surprisingly modest for a civilization of their size. To most of the galaxy, humanity looked like exactly what it appeared to be on the surface: a prosperous, technologically capable, but fundamentally timid people who preferred quiet diplomacy over any kind of confrontation. The truth, as it always tends to be with humanity, was considerably more complicated. Humans remembered something most of their neighbors had simply, comfortably forgotten across centuries of relative peace. War always spreads. No conflict, however contained it seems at first, remains distant forever. Every spark, left unattended long enough, eventually becomes a wildfire that consumes far more than anyone originally intended. That lesson had been etched into human history so many times, across so many separate catastrophes, that it had become something closer to instinct than policy. So Earth chose a different path entirely. Stay out of the galaxy's endless conflicts wherever possible. Protect their own people first. Help others where they reasonably could without becoming entangled. Fight only when there was genuinely no alternative left. For nearly 2 centuries, that strategy worked exactly as intended. Then came the Velkarn Imperium. The Velkarn were among the most feared conquerors in known space, towering reptilian warriors standing close to 3 meters tall, disciplined into a rigid military culture that treated peace as merely the pause between one victory and the next. They had conquered more than 400 star systems through sheer, relentless application of force, and their leadership had, across 2 centuries of continuous expansion, come to believe with total sincerity that strength alone conferred the right to rule. When a prolonged internal conflict finally aired one of the galaxy's older confederations, leaving dozens of newly independent systems suddenly unclaimed and undefended, the Velkarn saw nothing but opportunity. World after world fell beneath their banners with almost mechanical efficiency. Most governments surrendered before organized resistance could even properly form. Those few who fought back were crushed within weeks, and the Imperium grew stronger and bolder with every fresh conquest. Eventually, their steady expansion reached the outer edge of human-controlled space. Galactic observers immediately grew nervous. Everyone understood, by reputation alone, exactly what the Velkarn did to borders they found inconvenient. Human diplomats requested formal negotiations. The Velkarn laughed openly at the suggestion. Human ambassadors proposed trade agreements as an alternative path forward. The Velkarn ignored every proposal entirely. Earth attempted patient, persistent diplomacy for the better part of 8 months. Nothing changed. Then Supreme Commander Threxis Van of the Velkarn Imperium transmitted a single message to every major government in the galaxy, broadcast widely enough that billions watched it unfold in real time. The commander stood on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by armored officers, his pale yellow eyes carrying the particular arrogance of a man who had never once been meaningfully challenged. Humanity hides behind its neutrality because it fears war, Van said, his translated voice carrying across 100 worlds simultaneously. Earth claims peace is a form of strength. We disagree entirely. He allowed a slow, deliberate smile to spread across his face. A species unwilling to fight for what it claims to value deserves neither freedom nor territory. Across the galaxy, citizens on countless worlds watched the broadcast with a mixture of fascination and unease, waiting for some kind of human response. None came. Days passed, then weeks. Earth remained entirely silent. That silence, rather than discouraging the Velkarn, only emboldened them further. Their fleets edged steadily closer to human borders. New military outposts appeared near contested systems. Small, deliberate provocations increased steadily in frequency. Still, humanity refused to visibly react to any of it. Inside the Galactic Senate, politicians began openly mocking Earth's continued passivity. "They're afraid," one senator declared during an open session. "They always were. The Velkarn have simply been the first to say it plainly." Laughter rippled through the chamber. The human delegation present simply listened in silence, then quietly left without responding. The situation finally, catastrophically escalated 3 months later. A convoy of civilian refugee vessels emerged from hyperspace near the disputed border, carrying survivors fleeing a recently conquered world. Thousands of families, elderly civilians, and children who had lost absolutely everything they'd ever known. Earth immediately granted them full asylum. and human rescue vessels moved to escort the convoy safely toward protected territory. By any reasonable measure, that should have been the end of the matter. Instead, 3 Velkarn battlecruisers intercepted the refugee convoy well before it reached safety. The human escort ships demanded the Velkarn vessels stand down and withdraw. The Velkarn opened fire without further warning. The attack lasted less than 10 agonizing minutes. Several refugee ships were destroyed outright. Thousands of civilians died in the initial assault. The surviving vessels scattered in total panic, and human rescue crews desperately worked to save whoever they still could amid the wreckage and drifting debris. News networks across the galaxy broadcast the tragedy within hours, and shock spread rapidly through even the most war-hardened civilizations. The victims had been entirely unarmed, entirely defenseless. But what happened next unsettled the wider galaxy even more than the massacre itself. A surviving human rescue officer managed to transmit one final message before her communications were finally cut. That recording reached Earth within the hour, and from there it spread, almost instantly, across every human colony in existence. The footage showed burning refugee ships tumbling silently through space, panicked voices crying out over emergency channels, and faintly visible in the background, a Velkarn warship deliberately targeting escape pods as they launched. The officer's final recorded words were simple and devastating in their restraint. "They're targeting civilians. We need help." For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, Earth did not remain silent. Deep beneath the mountains of Earth, hidden inside oceans and long-forgotten lunar installations, ancient doors that had not opened in generations finally began to move. Across the Sol system, classified military networks that had lain dormant for decades activated within the same hour. Secure Camus. Nication channels that hadn't carried a live signal in a generation suddenly, quietly came alive. Fleet commanders across human space received an identical message. No lengthy explanation, no formal declaration, just 4 words. Authorization level Omega, granted. Throughout human territory, millions of military personnel rose from their stations in perfect, practiced unison, because every single one of them understood, immediately and without needing further clarification, exactly what those 4 words meant. The line had finally been crossed, and the galaxy was about to discover, in painstaking detail, precisely why Earth had avoided open war for as long as it possibly could. The moment authorization level Omega went out, everything changed at once. Across human space, systems that had sat dormant for generations suddenly stirred back to life. Deep beneath Earth's oceans, massive armored structures rose silently from concealed hangars carved decades earlier and never once used. On the far side of the moon, colossal blast doors opened for the first time since their original construction. Ancient shipyards buried deep within scattered asteroid belts came alive with sudden, purposeful activity. Automated construction drones swarming through open space like disturbed metal insects. The peaceful, unassuming image humanity had carefully presented to the galaxy for 2 centuries began, quietly and irreversibly, to crack. And behind that carefully maintained image lay something the wider galaxy had never once suspected: total, patient, generational preparation. The origins of that preparation traced back to the earliest years of humanity's own expansion into space, long before Earth had even formally joined the wider galactic community. In those early years, human strategists had studied the recorded histories of every alien civilization they could access, and a deeply disturbing pattern had gradually emerged from that research. Every major galactic power, without exception, eventually found itself drawn into large-scale war. Empires, republics, trade collectives, even machine civilizations, all of them, sooner or later, succumbed to conflict. Human analysts had reached a simple, sobering conclusion from that pattern. Peace in this particular galaxy was never permanent. It was only ever temporary, and the wider galaxy, rather than becoming genuinely safer over time, was steadily, quietly becoming more dangerous instead. So humanity developed a doctrine unlike anything any other civilization had previously attempted. Start no wars, threaten no neighbors, fight nothing that could reasonably be avoided, but prepare continuously and without exception for the worst realistic future imaginable. Every generation had added something new to that preparation. Every decade had quietly strengthened what came before it. While the wider galaxy mocked Earth's apparent passivity, hidden fleets multiplied steadily behind carefully maintained secrecy. Military technologies advanced behind layers of classification so thorough that even most senior human officials never gained full access to them. Entire industries existed solely to support defense programs whose true scope was known to only a small handful of people at any given time. Now, at long last, those decades of quiet preparation were finally being put to use. Inside Sol Defense Command, hundreds of officers monitored an overwhelming flood of incoming reports as massive holographic displays illuminated the command chamber. Fleet Admiral Elena Voss stood calmly at the center of it all, her expression carrying none of the visible alarm rippling through many of the junior officers around her. "Status update, Admiral," an aide asked, approaching her console. Voss nodded once. "Proceed." "First Reserve Fleet reports full operational readiness," one officer announced. "The 7th Strategic Fleet has completed deployment," a second reported. "Outer System Defense Groups confirm combat readiness across all sectors." The updates continued steadily, fleet after fleet, formation after formation. Thousands of warships, then tens of thousands. The sheer scale of humanity's hidden military presence visibly shocked even several junior officers seeing the complete mobilization data for the very first time in their careers. Voss finally turned toward the central display, where a full map of known space now glowed softly. Near the edge of human territory, a bright, insistent marker flashed steadily, representing the Velkarn Imperium's advancing fleet positions. "Any response from the Velkarn regarding the refugee massacre?" she asked. The communications officer shook her head. No apology, no explanation offered. Voss nodded slowly, entirely unsurprised. Exactly as expected. The Velkarn had always viewed compassion as a fundamental weakness. They believed with total conviction that fear alone guaranteed obedience, and they had simply assumed, without ever seriously questioning it, that humanity would eventually react precisely the way every other civilization they'd ever conquered had reacted, with protests, with outrage that eventually faded into quiet, resigned acceptance. They were wrong, and the price of that particular miscalculation was only just beginning to become clear. Meanwhile, deep inside Velkarn territory, Supreme Commander Threxus Van received the reports of humanity's sudden, unexpected mobilization with something closer to mild curiosity than genuine concern. The refugee massacre had, admittedly, generated more outrage across the wider galaxy than he'd initially anticipated. But outrage, in Van's considerable experience, rarely translated into meaningful action. His senior advisors had repeatedly warned him over the preceding months against provoking humanity too aggressively. Van had dismissed every single warning without hesitation. The humans had spent nearly 2 centuries steadfastly refusing to fight anyone, and that pattern, to Van's mind, told him everything genuinely useful he needed to know about their true character. They lacked resolve. Soon, Earth would surrender several of its border systems as a gesture of appeasement. Additional concessions would inevitably follow after that. The pattern in his considerable experience was entirely predictable. A young intelligence officer entered his command chamber, visibly hesitant, clutching a data pad tightly against his chest. "What is it?" Van asked, barely glancing up. "Commander, we're receiving unusual sensor reports from our border monitoring stations." Van's expression didn't shift at all. "Explain." "Human fleet movements, sir. Substantial ones." Several nearby generals exchanged mildly amused glances. One of them chuckled openly. "How many ships? 20? 30? The young officer's throat visibly tightened. "No, sir." "Then how many?" He activated a small holographic display. Dozens of blinking contact symbols appeared immediately, and then, within seconds, hundreds more. The chamber fell into sudden, uneasy silence. "These are confirmed detections only," the officer added, his voice noticeably strained. A senior Velkarn general stared at the expanding display in open disbelief. "That's simply not possible." The officer swallowed hard. "We thought precisely the same thing, sir, until roughly an hour ago." More contacts continued appearing steadily across the display. Carrier groups, dedicated battle fleets, logistics formations, heavy assault squadrons, all in numbers far beyond anything previously associated with any human military assessment on record. Similar reports began arriving simultaneously from Velkarn intelligence networks across several neighboring regions. Human warships, it seemed, were suddenly emerging everywhere at once, as though entire armadas had simply materialized directly out of empty space. For the first time since the invasion planning had begun, a flicker of genuine uncertainty finally entered Commander Van's mind. He suppressed it almost immediately. "No matter," he said, rising from his throne with practiced confidence. "Even if these humans possess a larger fleet than our estimates suggested, they still lack any meaningful combat experience whatsoever." Several officers nodded in immediate, reassured agreement. It was, on its surface, an entirely reasonable assumption. Unfortunately for all of them, reality rarely concerns itself with comforting assumptions, however reasonable they might initially appear. Back on Earth, a very different kind of meeting was already underway. Unlike previous purely military briefings, this particular session included the full civilian leadership of the human government, presidents, colonial governors, regional representatives, the highest authorities across the entirety of human space, all gathered in a single secure chamber. A large display screen showed footage recovered from the refugee massacre. Nobody in the room spoke while the recording played in full. When it finally ended, a heavy, deliberate silence settled over the chamber. The Secretary General eventually turned toward Admiral Voss. "Can we still avoid open war?" The question hung in the room for a long moment. Everyone present already suspected the answer. "No," Voss said simply. The Secretary General nodded slowly, accepting it without argument. "What options remain available to us?" Voss's expression hardened slightly. We could retreat entirely from the contested border regions. Nobody in the room reacted. We could attempt further negotiation. Still nothing. We could issue additional formal protests through official diplomatic channels. A few officials exchanged uneasy glances at that suggestion. Or, Voss finished, we can ensure something like this can never happen again. The room understood, immediately and completely, exactly what she meant by that final option. For generations, humanity had consistently chosen restraint over confrontation. That restraint, now unmistakably failed. The refugee convoy had trusted Earth for protection during their darkest hour. Children had died directly beneath a human military escort. That failure could not simply be absorbed and forgotten. After several long moments of heavy silence, the Secretary General rose from her seat. Then humanity acts. One by one, every representative present cast their formal vote. The result was unanimous. Not a single dissenting voice anywhere in the chamber. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, humanity had officially, deliberately entered a full galactic war. Within minutes of that vote, encrypted orders spread rapidly across thousands of separate fleets throughout human space. Task force groups began accelerating toward the contested frontier. Carrier formations entered hyperspace transit. Strategic reserves shifted immediately into active operational status. And in classified facilities scattered across human territory, some of the most powerful weapons ever developed by human hands received their long-dormant activation codes for the very first time in their existence. Far beyond the border, Velkarn forces continued their steady preparations for what their commanders still confidently assumed would be an easy, straightforward conquest. They still believed, right up until the final moment, that humanity's anger amounted to nothing more than empty diplomatic posturing. They still believed intimidation alone would ultimately carry the day. None of them yet understood the terrifying reality that humanity had spent 2 full centuries quietly, patiently studying the very concept of war, preparing methodically for exactly this eventuality, and was now, finally, prepared to demonstrate everything it had learned across that long, careful silence. The news of humanity's formal declaration spread through the galaxy considerably faster than any military fleet ever could have. For nearly 2 centuries, Earth had maintained strict, unbroken neutrality through every major regional conflict. Entire empires had risen and fallen while humanity remained firmly on the sidelines, consistently offering aid rather than weapons. Now, without warning, that same civilization was suddenly, fully mobilizing for open war. The Galactic Senate immediately dissolved into open chaos. Emergency sessions were convened across a dozen different sectors simultaneously. Diplomats argued furiously across countless secure communication channels. Military analysts across the galaxy scrambled desperately to understand exactly what was actually unfolding. But one central question remained stubbornly, frustratingly unanswered by anyone. How genuinely strong was humanity, really? Nobody knew for certain, not even Earth's closest existing allies, because for nearly 2 centuries, humans had deliberately revealed almost nothing meaningful about their true military capacity. Now, belatedly, the wider galaxy was beginning to understand exactly how dangerous that particular ignorance might actually prove to be. Far beyond the established frontier, Task Force Meridian dropped abruptly out of hyperspace directly alongside the primary Velkarn advance. The fleet materialized in complete, deliberate silence. No opening broadcast, no formal warning, simply hundreds of warships appearing at once, their formation stretching across several million kilometers of open space. At the center of that formation floated the flagship Resolute line. Unlike most Velkarn vessels, with their heavily ornamented hulls and deliberately intimidating silhouettes, human warships carried almost no decorative elements whatsoever. Everything about their design was purely functional, cold, efficient, unmistakably built for war rather than for spectacle. On the bridge of the Resolute line, Fleet Admiral Elena Voss studied her own tactical display carefully. Red markers indicated Velkarn forces still operating near the site of the earlier refugee massacre. Blue markers showed the arriving human task force. The numbers heavily, unmistakably favored humanity. "Admiral," her communications officer reported, "Velkarn patrol fleet has detected our arrival." "Response?" Voss asked. "They're demanding immediate identification." She considered that briefly. "Transmit our designation." The officer opened the channel, and a simple message crossed the void toward the waiting Velkarn patrol. "Human Military Command. You are currently operating within a designated combat exclusion zone. Withdraw immediately." The response arrived almost instantly. Laughter, unmistakable even through the translation matrix. Several Velkarn officers appeared briefly on the returning transmission, their commander grinning broadly. "You humans have finally discovered your courage," the Velkarn commander said mockingly. Nobody on the human bridge reacted visibly. "You should have remained safely hidden behind your diplomats," the commander continued, his grin widening further. Still silence from the human side. "Now turn your ships around before we're forced to destroy them." Admiral Voss studied the transmission calmly, then asked a single question of her own. "Are any refugee survivors currently present within this sector?" The Velkarn commander frowned, visibly caught off guard. "What?" "Answer the question." The alien commander laughed again, dismissively. "A few, perhaps." Voss nodded slowly, absorbing the answer without visible reaction, then ended the transmission entirely. The Velkarn patrol seemed genuinely confused by the abrupt disconnection. Moments later, the entire human formation shifted configuration. Thousands of targeting systems activated simultaneously across the fleet. Missile bays opened in perfect unison. Railgun batteries rotated smoothly toward the waiting enemy positions. The Velkarn commander's earlier grin finally, visibly disappeared. "Commander," one of his own officers whispered urgently, "they're locking weapons on us." For the first time, genuine uncertainty entered the Velkarn patrol's ranks. Not outright fear yet, simply uncertainty. Back aboard the Resolute line, Voss issued a final, formal warning. "Enemy fleet has 30 seconds to withdraw." The countdown began, 30, 29, 28. The Velkarn ships remained stubbornly in position. Their commander genuinely believed, right up until the very last moment, that the humans were simply bluffing. Threats, in his considerable experience, were an entirely normal part of galactic diplomacy. Actual combat remained expensive and dangerous for everyone involved. Nobody fired first anymore if they could reasonably avoid it. 10 seconds remained. The Velkarn ship still held their formation. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Voss looked toward her tactical officer. "Execute." The engagement lasted exactly 11 seconds. Across the surrounding darkness, thousands of hypersonic missiles launched simultaneously toward the Velkarn formation. The patrol barely had time to react at all. Their defense systems activated automatically, point defense batteries opening fire, interceptor drones flooding outward to meet the incoming barrage. It wasn't nearly enough. The first wave struck with devastating, surgical precision. Enemy shields collapsed almost instantly. A second wave arrived less than a full second later. Cruisers exploded outward in expanding clouds of debris. Destroyer-class vessels shattered apart entirely. Command ships vanished completely in brilliant flashes of superheated plasma. Before the surviving Velkarn crews could even begin to properly recover, human railgun batteries opened fire as well, hurling tungsten projectiles, accelerated to genuinely incredible velocities across the intervening distance. Each individual impact carried more than enough kinetic energy to devastate an entire warship in a single strike. Within moments, the Velkarn patrol fleet had ceased to exist as any kind of coherent fighting force. 11 seconds, that was the entirety of the engagement. Surviving sensor drones transmitted recordings of the brief battle across nearby systems almost immediately. Military observers throughout the region watched the footage in genuine disbelief, replaying it repeatedly to confirm what they were actually seeing. The conclusion remained unavoidable, no matter how many times anyone reviewed the recording. The Velkarn patrol hadn't simply lost the engagement. They had been thoroughly, completely annihilated. Deep inside Velkarn territory, Commander Van received the full report in stony silence. Combat footage played across his command chamber, destroyed cruisers, shattered formations, a battle that had lasted barely 11 seconds from beginning to end. When the recording finally concluded, one of his senior generals spoke first. "A lucky strike," he offered. "They caught the patrol entirely by surprise." Another general nodded quickly in agreement. The patrol simply wasn't prepared for the engagement. Nobody in the room seemed genuinely willing to acknowledge the far more uncomfortable, obvious truth sitting directly in front of them. Van rose slowly from his throne, his massive claws digging visibly into the armrests. "Mobilize the Third Battle Armada," he said finally. The chamber fell instantly, completely silent. That particular fleet was legendary throughout Velkarn military history, more than 6,000 warships, crewed entirely by veteran officers with decades of accumulated combat experience between them. Entire civilizations had surrendered simply upon hearing of its approach, long before it ever actually arrived. "I want the human fleet destroyed completely," Van said, his voice carrying no room whatsoever for further argument or discussion. The order spread immediately across the entirety of Velkarn space. Military shipyards accelerated production schedules dramatically. Reserve fleets activated in rapid succession. Entire armadas began preparing for full-scale, total war. Imperium had finally, belatedly, decided to take humanity seriously as an actual threat. Unfortunately for them, they remained considerably behind the true scope of the situation, because the fleet that had just annihilated their border patrol represented barely 1% of humanity's total available military strength. Back on Earth, intelligence reports continued arriving steadily throughout the following days. The initial engagement had been an unambiguous success, but military planners understood with complete clarity that the true conflict still lay ahead. The Velkarn would inevitably respond with overwhelming numerical force. That much had always been entirely predictable, and human strategists had planned extensively around exactly that eventuality. Inside a heavily classified lunar command facility, An entirely different group of officers continued monitoring far deeper, considerably more sensitive military assets, not ordinary fleet formations, but ancient contingency systems and emergency protocols developed generations earlier for precisely this kind of extreme scenario. One junior officer studied the incoming reports carefully, then glanced toward the authorization terminal sitting quietly at his station. "Do you think we'll actually need them?" he asked his senior commander. The commander remained silent for several long moments. "I sincerely hope not," he finally admitted. "Why not?" the younger officer asked, genuinely curious. The senior commander stared out at the stars visible through the observation window. "Because if we're ever forced to activate those particular systems, this conflict stops being a war in any meaningful sense," he said quietly. "It starts becoming something considerably closer to an extinction event for whoever happens to be standing on the receiving end of it." Millions of kilometers distant, the Third Battle Armada finally entered hyperspace transit, more than 6,000 Velkarn warships accelerating steadily toward human territory. Their commanders confidently expected total, decisive victory. Their soldiers anticipated straightforward conquest. Their own government back home fully expected humanity's inevitable, humiliating surrender. None of them yet understood that they were, in fact, heading directly into the largest, most carefully prepared military trap in the entirety of human history. And humanity was already patiently waiting for them. The Third Battle Armada represented the absolute pride of the Velkarn Imperium. For nearly a full century, it had crushed every single enemy ever placed in front of it. Entire civilizations had surrendered simply upon hearing its name spoken aloud. Its commanders' war medals earned across dozens of prior campaigns. Its warships represented the very best military technology the Imperium possessed after 2 centuries of continuous refinement. Now all 6,000 of those vessels were advancing steadily toward human space. Aboard the flagship Iron Talon, Supreme Fleet Marshal Korvath Drass studied a massive tactical display with practiced, unshakable confidence. His fleet vastly outnumbered anything humanity had demonstrated thus far in the conflict. One destroyed border patrol meant essentially nothing in the broader context of an actual war. Wars, in his considerable experience, were never won through isolated skirmishes. They were won through the patient, overwhelming application of superior numbers. "Estimated arrival time?" Drass asked his navigation officer. The officer checked his readouts carefully. 23 hours, Marshal." Drass nodded, satisfied with the projection. "Excellent. When we finally reach human territory, I want every available communication relay broadcasting our approach continuously. Let humanity witness this armada's arrival firsthand. Let fear spread naturally through their colonies well ahead of our actual attack. Let them fully understand that meaningful resistance is entirely futile." Several nearby officers smiled at the suggestion. Psychological pressure had always proven remarkably effective against less disciplined civilizations. The fleet continued its steady approach, confident and thoroughly disciplined, entirely unaware of what actually awaited them. Because while the Third Battle Armada traveled steadily toward the frontier, humanity had already spent the preceding days preparing something considerably more elaborate than a simple defensive line. Far beyond the established border, hidden within an unremarkable, seemingly worthless star cluster, thousands of human warships waited in complete silence. The location appeared on the surface to be strategically meaningless. No significant colonies, no valuable natural resources, nothing suggesting any particular importance whatsoever. To most military analysts, it would have registered as simply another empty, forgettable region of space. That impression was, of course, entirely deliberate. For decades, human engineers had Hewlettly transformed the entire cluster into an elaborate, fully concealed defensive network. Sensor platforms sat hidden inside ordinary-looking asteroids. Weapons arrays lay concealed within otherwise unremarkable moons. Autonomous defense systems had been buried across countless scattered objects throughout the region. From the outside, the cluster appeared entirely harmless. In actual reality, it functioned as a fully armed fortress, hidden in plain sight. Aboard the Resolute line, Admiral Voss studied incoming intelligence reports carefully. The Velkarn Armada was following precisely the route human strategists had originally predicted, weeks in advance. Every fleet movement matched their simulation models exactly. Every tactical decision aligned perfectly with existing expectations. The enemy genuinely believed they were actively hunting a fleeing, disorganized enemy force. In reality, they were being carefully, deliberately guided. Task Forces Meridian and Solstice have reached their designated positions, her communications officer reported. Voss nodded, satisfied. Status of the full defense network. Fully operational, Admiral. Strategic reserve standing ready. She studied the star map carefully, feeling the accumulated weight of 2 full centuries of quiet, patient planning finally converging on this single, decisive moment. Generations of careful preparation, countless classified military exercises, all of it steadily building toward exactly this outcome. Soon, the wider galaxy would finally understand precisely why humanity had avoided open war for as long as it possibly could. Because humans understood, with total clarity, exactly how devastating they could become once genuinely forced into one. Hours later, the first major confrontation of the war finally began in earnest. Long-range sensors detected the approaching Velkarn Armada entering the designated combat zone. Thousands of warships emerged from hyperspace transit in rapid succession. The sight was, by any measure, genuinely overwhelming, endless formations stretching across the surrounding darkness. Battleships, cruisers, dedicated carriers, assault platforms, an entire wall of steel and coordinated firepower advancing steadily toward human territory. Aboard the Iron Talon, Marshal Drass smiled with obvious satisfaction. "Finally," he said quietly, "a genuinely worthy demonstration of our strength." Then his sensor officer spoke up, his voice carrying an unmistakable note of confusion. "Human fleet detected, Marshal." Drass leaned forward slightly. "Numbers." The officer hesitated visibly. "Approximately 2,000 vessels, sir." Several senior officers audibly relaxed at that report. The numbers still heavily favored the Imperium, roughly 3-1. It was, by Velkarn military doctrine, precisely the kind of engagement they preferred and had trained extensively for. Drass nodded, confident. "Advance." The Armada accelerated smoothly toward the awaiting human formation. Across the intervening void, human ships maintained their position without moving. Neither side fired. Neither side altered its heading in any way. Millions of kilometers steadily disappeared between the two advancing fleets, and the mounting tension aboard both formations became almost physically unbearable. Then suddenly the human fleet turned, not away from the approaching enemy, sideways instead. The unexpected maneuver visibly confused several Velkarn commanders. "Why are they repositioning?" Drass demanded. No immediate answer came. Then his sensors detected something genuinely strange. Energy spikes, dozens of them, appearing suddenly across nearby moons, within scattered asteroid fields, throughout drifting planetary debris. Every hidden installation across the entire cluster activated at precisely the same moment. The tactical display abruptly exploded with fresh contacts. Drass stared at the rapidly multiplying readings in open disbelief. Hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of additional signatures. Weapons platforms materialized everywhere at once. Automated defense batteries emerged from what had, seconds earlier, appeared to be completely ordinary rock formations. Missile silos activated across the entire region. Orbital cannons powered fully online. The entire star cluster, in the span of perhaps 30 seconds, had woken up entirely, and every single weapon system was now aimed directly at the Velkarn Armada. For the first time in his considerable military career, Marshal Korvath Drass felt something genuinely resembling fear. This is not possible," he whispered. A human transmission suddenly appeared across every single Velkarn screen simultaneously. Admiral Voss stood calmly before the camera, her expression carrying neither anger nor satisfaction. Only complete, unwavering certainty. "You have entered sovereign human defense space," she said. The Armada continued its forward advance, though visible confidence had already begun visibly draining from the assembled officers. They stared, transfixed, at the vast, hidden network of defenses surrounding them from every conceivable direction. Voss continued speaking, her tone entirely level. "You attacked unarmed civilians." Behind her, footage began playing automatically, burning refugee ships, destroyed escape pods, the recovered bodies of entire families drifting silently through open space. The exact same recording that had originally pushed humanity into declaring open war. "You were given one clear warning," Voss finished simply. The transmission ended abruptly. Absolute silence gripped the command decks of both opposing fleets simultaneously. Then every single human weapon fired at once. The surrounding stars themselves seemed to visibly erupt with sudden light. Missiles flooded the void by the millions. Railguns unleashed continuous storms of superheated metal. Energy beams carved brilliant, burning channels through the darkness. The hidden fortress finally revealed its true, devastating purpose. Entire Velkarn formations vanished almost instantly beneath the opening barrage. Cruisers exploded before they could even complete basic defensive maneuvers. Battleships lost their shielding almost immediately. Coordinated command networks collapsed entirely under sustained, simultaneous electronic attack. Panic spread rapidly throughout the Armada. The hunters, in the span of mere minutes, had unmistakably become the prey. And this proved to be only the very beginning, because far away, deep beneath the surface of Earth's own moon, a classified alert suddenly appeared inside humanity's central strategic command. One message, one critical warning, one genuinely terrifying development. Additional Velkarn fleets were mobilizing throughout their territory. Not merely thousands of additional warships, not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The Imperium had apparently decided, in the face of unexpected defeat, to commit absolutely everything they possessed. The war was rapidly, unavoidably becoming considerably larger than anyone had originally anticipated. And hidden within the deepest, most closely guarded military vaults of humanity, ancient contingency plans, created generations earlier for the singular day, an entire hostile empire might genuinely attempt to destroy Earth itself, finally began, very quietly, to stir awake. The Battle of the Silent Cluster quickly became the single most closely watched military engagement in recorded galactic history. Across thousands of separate worlds, billions of individuals watched live tactical feeds as the previously unstoppable Velkarn Armada walked directly into humanity's carefully prepared trap. The results were, by any measure, devastating. Entire Velkarn formations vanished beneath relentless, coordinated waves of missile fire. Automated defense grids fired with almost mechanical precision. Hidden railgun networks hurled projectiles across millions of kilometers of open space. Every single movement the Velkarn attempted had already been anticipated. Every improvised countermeasure had already been thoroughly planned for in advance. For 2 full centuries, humanity had quietly, patiently studied the theory and practice of warfare. That accumulated knowledge was now, finally, being fully unleashed. Aboard the Iron Talon, alarms screamed continuously across every deck. Tactical displays flashed crimson warnings without pause. Marshal Drass watched in mounting disbelief as another battleship vanished entirely from his own tactical display. Then another, then several more in rapid succession. "Status report," he demanded, his voice sharp with mounting alarm. A frightened junior officer looked up from his console. 22% fleet losses, Marshal." The bridge fell into stunned silence. The battle had barely even properly begun. Drass clenched his massive claws tightly. "This is not possible. No military force should be capable of inflicting this scale of damage." Yet the mounting evidence surrounded him on every side. Humanity's hidden defense network was systematically dismantling his entire armada, piece by devastating piece. Then another officer spoke up urgently. "Marshal, human fleets are advancing." The display zoomed outward, revealing thousands of previously reserved human warships now advancing steadily forward, rather than remaining safely behind the defensive perimeter. Not retreating, not simply holding position, advancing directly. The realization struck Drass like a physical blow. The hidden fortress had never actually been intended to stop the Velkarn advance entirely. It had been designed, from the very beginning, to methodically weaken them first. The genuine attack was only just now beginning. Meanwhile, aboard the Resolute line, Admiral Voss remained entirely focused on the unfolding engagement. The initial phase had succeeded well beyond even her own expectations. Enemy formations were badly fractured. Decommunications across the Armada were thoroughly disrupted. Command structures were rapidly collapsing, exactly according to plan. A young officer glanced toward her. "Admiral, shall we proceed with Phase 2? Voss nodded once. "Execute." Within seconds, thousands of human warships surged forward simultaneously. Their formation, however, immediately confused every remaining Velkarn observer still capable of analyzing the battle. Rather than adopting traditional military groupings, the fleet split apart into dozens of independent strike groups, each one following an entirely unique attack vector with remarkable individual precision. Analysts across the galaxy watching the recorded footage would spend years afterward attempting to fully understand what they were actually witnessing. The attacks initially appeared disconnected, almost randomly chaotic, until the underlying pattern finally became clear. Human fleets weren't targeting individual ships at all. They were systematically targeting entire systems instead. Fuel distribution networks, communication relays, coordination hubs, targeting infrastructure, supply chains. Within a matter of hours, the Armada's overwhelming numerical advantage had become almost entirely meaningless. because numbers ultimately mean very little once an army can no longer effectively function as a coordinated, unified force. Back in the Velkarn capital, Supreme Commander Threxus Van watched the escalating disaster unfold in real time. Reports arriving from the front lines grew progressively worse with every passing hour. Losses had already exceeded every prior projection by a significant margin. Entire formations were disappearing from operational status entirely. And perhaps most damaging of all, morale throughout the Armada was visibly collapsing. The Velkarn had spent generations genuinely believing themselves fundamentally unbeatable. That deeply held belief was now, unmistakably, shattering in real time. One of Van's advisors finally spoke up, visibly nervous. "Commander, perhaps formal negotiations should be seriously considered at this point." The chamber went instantly, completely silent. Suggesting negotiation during active wartime carried genuine political danger under any circumstances. Suggesting it now, in the midst of this particular disaster, bordered on outright suicidal. Van's eyes narrowed sharply. The advisor immediately, visibly regretted speaking at all. Before any actual punishment could be administered, another officer rushed urgently into the chamber, clearly terrified. "Commander," he said, "you need to see this immediately." He activated a large holographic display, revealing a detailed map of known Velkarn space. Dozens of separate sectors flashed urgently in warning red. Van frowned, studying the unfamiliar pattern. "What exactly am I looking at?" The officer swallowed hard, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. "Human fleet movements, Commander." Van's eyes widened as understanding slowly dawned. These weren't additional fleets converging on the ongoing battle at all. They were fleets deliberately bypassing it entirely, striking instead deep within Velkarn territory itself, hitting military shipyards, critical weapons factories, essential supply depots, vital strategic infrastructure, one after another, methodically erased from operational status. The humans had apparently discovered entirely unmonitored transit routes deep into Velkarn space, routes nobody in the Imperium had ever known existed at all. One by one, critical military assets simply disappeared from the tactical map entirely. The Imperium wasn't merely losing an isolated battle anymore. It was steadily, systematically losing its fundamental ability to continue waging war at all. For the first time since the conflict had properly begun, genuine, unmistakable fear finally spread through the highest levels of Velkarn leadership. Meanwhile, inside a classified lunar facility deep beneath Earth's surface, another critical strategic meeting was already underway. Unlike previous briefings, this particular session involved humanity's oldest and most senior strategic council, men and women whose actual responsibilities had remained deliberately hidden from public knowledge for generations. A massive, heavily reinforced vault door stood prominently behind them, marked simply with a single designation. Project Sentinel. The Velkarn have committed additional reserve fleets, a senior officer reported to the assembled council. A holographic display illuminated automatically, showing hundreds of thousands of additional enemy warships, entire reserve armadas, colonial defense fleets, essentially everything the Imperium currently possessed. "If current intelligence proves accurate," the officer continued, "they intend to commit to genuinely total war." Nobody in the room appeared especially surprised by that development. Humanity had predicted this exact escalation decades earlier, during the original strategic planning. Another council member glanced toward the sealed vault. Then perhaps we require Sentinel after all. Several others exchanged distinctly uneasy glances. The project remained legendary even among this highly classified circle. Very few people, even within this room, fully understood its true capabilities. The council chairman finally spoke. Not yet. The room relaxed slightly, though only slightly, because everyone present understood exactly what that particular answer actually meant. Sentinel remained inactive for now, but the genuine possibility of its use existed, and that possibility alone was thoroughly, deeply unsettling to everyone aware of it. Far away, the ongoing battle continued to unfold. Human fleets pushed steadily deeper into fractured enemy formations. Velkarn resistance weakened noticeably with every passing hour, but fresh sensor reports were already arriving, confirming that additional enemy armadas were converging from multiple separate directions simultaneously. The Imperium had chosen full escalation, a final, desperate gamble, an attempt to overwhelm humanity through sheer accumulated numbers alone. What they didn't yet understand was that numbers were precisely what humanity's strategic planners had anticipated from the very beginning, decades in advance. The war continued into its third month. By every traditional military measure, the Velkarn Imperium should, by this point, have been winning decisively. They still possessed more total territory, more accumulated resources, considerably more soldiers, and now, following full mobilization, considerably more warships as well. Fresh armadas continued pouring steadily toward the ongoing conflict. Entire reserve fleets emerged from previously untouched sectors. Colonial defense forces were rapidly reassigned to active combat duty. Ancient battleships were pulled directly from long-term storage and returned immediately to active service. The overall numbers involved had become genuinely staggering. Military analysts throughout the galaxy estimated that well over 300,000 Velkarn warships were now formally committed to the ongoing conflict. No civilization in recent recorded galactic history had ever previously assembled a comparable military force for a single engagement. Yet remarkably, humanity remained entirely calm throughout the escalation. That particular fact, more than anything else, genuinely terrified outside galactic observers watching the conflict unfold from a safe distance. Inside the Galactic Senate, emergency sessions continued around the clock without pause. Representatives studied incoming battlefield reports with steadily mounting disbelief. One senator eventually voiced the question everyone present had been quietly, privately wondering. Why aren't the humans genuinely worried? Nobody present had a satisfying answer, because nobody actually knew for certain. Far away, aboard the Resolute line, Admiral Voss received updated intelligence regarding the mounting enemy reinforcements. The tactical display showed countless additional red markers, wave after wave of fresh reinforcements, representing the single largest military concentration observed in generations of recorded conflict. A young officer beside her looked visibly uneasy. "Admiral, they simply keep coming." Voss studied the display calmly. "Yes. Do we have sufficient forces to counter this?" The Admiral looked over at him and allowed herself the smallest, briefest smile. "More than enough." Several days later, long-range sensors finally detected the Velkarn's true main offensive beginning to move. The resulting armada was genuinely enormous, hundreds of thousands of individual warships, forming an unbroken wall of destruction, advancing steadily toward human territory. Even experienced human officers paused visibly when they first witnessed the full scale of the approaching numbers. A communications officer eventually looked toward Admiral Voss. "Orders, Admiral." The bridge fell completely silent, waiting. Voss studied the approaching armada for a long, deliberate moment. Then she activated a secure channel directly to Lunar Strategic Command, transmitting a single, simple query regarding Project Sentinel's current activation status. Several long seconds passed before a reply finally arrived. The officer reading it aloud visibly paled. "Admiral," he said, "Sentinel reports 98% operational readiness." Silence spread quickly across the entire bridge. Everyone present understood immediately, without needing further explanation, precisely what that particular status update actually meant. The war's final, decisive phase was rapidly approaching, and once Sentinel finally reached full activation, the fundamental balance of power across the entire galaxy would change permanently and irrevocably. Far across the stars, the massive Velkarn armada continued its steady, confident advance. Its commanders genuinely believed they were finally marching toward decisive, total victory. Its soldiers anticipated an inevitable, straightforward conquest. But hidden deep beneath the surface of Earth's own moon, something considerably older and considerably more patient was finally, fully awakening. And when Project Sentinel eventually reached 100% operational activation, the wider galaxy would finally discover humanity's single greatest, most carefully guarded secret. Everything the galaxy had witnessed thus far represented merely the very beginning. The message finally arrived at exactly the moment humanity's strategic planners had quietly anticipated for decades. It appeared instantly across thousands of separate secure military networks throughout human space. Every fleet commander received it simultaneously. Every strategic facility formally acknowledged it. Every classified installation reacted immediately. The message itself contained only 3 words: "Sentinel is online." For a brief moment, nothing visibly happened. No dramatic explosions, no sweeping announcements, no single massive weapon suddenly firing across the stars. The galaxy continued turning exactly as it always had. But beneath that deceptively calm surface, humanity had just entered an entirely new phase of the ongoing conflict. Deep below the lunar surface, Project Sentinel completed its final activation sequence. Hundreds of quantum processors synchronized instantly. Ancient strategic networks connected seamlessly across the whole of human space. Millions of previously dormant autonomous systems came fully online simultaneously. The system had originally been conceived following humanity's very first extended exposure to recorded galactic history. Human strategists, studying the wars of countless prior civilizations, had identified a consistent, troubling pattern. Civilizations tended to eventually lose major conflicts because they relied too heavily on individual leadership. Commanders were assassinated. Command centers were destroyed. Governments collapsed entirely under sustained pressure, and chaos inevitably followed. Sentinel had been specifically designed to prevent exactly that particular failure mode. It functioned not merely as a military weapons system, but as an entire civilization-scale survival architecture, an intelligence network genuinely capable of coordinating entire sectors independently, a logistical framework connecting every human colony simultaneously, a strategic architecture explicitly designed to continue functioning even if entire worlds were somehow lost in the process. Humanity had spent generations quietly, patiently building it, Now, finally, it was fully awake. Meanwhile, far beyond human territory, the Velkarn Grand Armada continued its steady advance, nearly 300,000 warships now filling multiple separate sectors simultaneously. The sight alone genuinely unsettled even neutral governments watching cautiously from a safe distance. No fleet of that particular scale had ever previously been assembled in recorded galactic history. Supreme Commander Van stood proudly aboard his newly commissioned flagship, Imperium's Judgment, personally taking direct field command for the first time in the entire campaign. Failure was no longer, in his own considered judgment, an acceptable outcome. Humanity had thoroughly humiliated the Imperium's reputation. Now the wider galaxy would witness genuine Velkarn vengeance delivered in full. Several hours later, the first troubling reports began quietly arriving. Initially, they seemed relatively minor and isolated. A single supply depot had unexpectedly vanished from operational status. Then a fuel reserve station suddenly disappeared entirely. A communications relay abruptly stopped responding to any contact attempts. Then another. Then several more in steady succession. Within a single day, more than 100 separate military facilities throughout Velkarn territory had been effectively neutralized without any warning whatsoever. Van frowned deeply at the growing pattern. Human raiding parties, he concluded aloud. His intelligence officer shook his head slowly. No confirmed fleet movements detected anywhere in the vicinity, Commander. If not fleets, then what exactly is responsible? The answer arrived only minutes later in the form of recovered sensor footage. The bridge crew watched in growing unease as the recording played out in full. A military supply depot floated peacefully in stable orbit around an otherwise unremarkable moon. Without any warning whatsoever, dozens of small objects suddenly emerged from stealth, tiny compared to any conventional warship, almost genuinely insignificant in scale. Then they attacked in overwhelming numbers, automated drones, thousands of them, swarming the depot like disturbed metallic insects. Its defenses were overwhelmed within mere minutes. Critical systems were systematically disabled. The depot exploded shortly afterward. The recording ended abruptly. Silence gripped the bridge completely. A second recording began playing immediately afterward, then a third, then a fourth, each one following essentially the same devastating pattern. Military analysts finally understood what Project Sentinel actually represented in practice. Humanity had effectively transformed the entire concept of warfare into pure, relentless mathematics. Every destroyed ship was steadily replaced. Every lost drone was rapidly rebuilt. Every damaged facility was efficiently repaired. The system adapted, continuously and without pause, faster than any enemy could realistically respond. For every single Velkarn victory achieved, humanity generated 10 entirely new solutions in response. And Sentinel, unlike any organic commander, never slept, never grew tired, and never once panicked under pressure. The Imperium suddenly found itself confronting an opponent that appeared genuinely, fundamentally impossible to exhaust through conventional means. Days later, the massive Velkarn armada finally reached the outer edge of human territory. This represented, by any reasonable measure, the decisive confrontation, the single engagement that would ultimately determine the war's final outcome. Countless observers throughout the galaxy tuned in to watch the unfolding military broadcast. Entire civilizations paused their normal activities to observe. The Armada entered the designated combat zone directly. Almost immediately, something felt distinctly, unmistakably wrong. No human fleets appeared anywhere on their scanners. No defensive formations materialized. No visible resistance presented itself at all. The surrounding sectors appeared, on the surface, almost completely empty of any human presence whatsoever. Van allowed himself a brief, confident smile. Perhaps the humans had finally recognized the futility of continued resistance. Perhaps they were already retreating entirely. Then his sensor alarms activated suddenly and violently. One officer froze completely at his station. "Commander," he said, his voice trembling audibly. Van turned sharply. "What is it now?" The officer's voice shook badly. "Contact, sir." "How many?" The officer's face had gone visibly pale. "Too many to accurately count, Commander." The tactical display expanded rapidly outward. Red contact symbols began filling the entire screen. Not hundreds, not thousands, millions of individual signatures. The bridge fell into complete, horrified silence. Every officer present stared at the display in open, uncomprehending disbelief. The contacts weren't conventional warships at all. They were drones, attack drones, interceptor drones, dedicated missile platforms, electronic warfare units, reconnaissance systems, an entire mechanical ocean stretching endlessly across the surrounding darkness. Humanity had not, in fact, deployed a conventional fleet at all. Humanity had deployed an entire self-sustaining ecosystem. The swarm began moving forward as one coordinated entity. Millions of individual machines accelerated simultaneously. The stars themselves seemed to visibly vanish behind the advancing tide of gleaming metal. For the first time since the conflict had properly begun, genuine, unfiltered fear finally spread openly throughout the Velkarn command structure. Because absolutely no existing military doctrine anywhere in recorded galactic history had ever properly prepared them for a threat of this particular scale and nature. And remarkably, this swarm still wasn't even Sentinel's primary intended function. Back beneath the lunar surface, another heavily secured vault door finally opened, one considerably older than the others present, protected by security protocols so extensive that even senior admirals lacked sufficient clearance to override them independently. The chamber beyond contained something genuinely enormous, something that had remained hidden since the very earliest days of humanity's initial expansion into space. A project considered, even by internal standards, far too dangerous for normal, routine deployment. The council chairman studied the activation screen carefully, then finally spoke. "Sentinel Phase 2 authorization approved." Officers throughout the chamber exchanged visibly nervous glances. Everyone present understood precisely what that particular authorization actually meant. The drone swarm currently engaging the Velkarn Armada represented merely the shield. Phase 2 represented the sword. And somewhere deep within the darkness of that ancient, sealed vault, colossal systems finally began awakening for the first time in generations. The war was about to fundamentally change once again, and this time, even humanity's closest existing allies might genuinely find themselves afraid of exactly what Earth had spent so many patient generations quietly creating. The galaxy watched in absolute, collective, stunned silence. Millions of human drones flooded the ongoing battlefield. The mechanical swarm stretched steadily across entire sectors, moving with an eerie, coordinated precision that resembled a single living organism rather than a mechanical construct. Every passing second brought new formations into view. Every minute, the entire swarm adapted its tactics in real time. Velkarn commanders had genuinely never encountered anything remotely comparable in their entire military history. Traditional warfare had always depended fundamentally on crewed fleets. Fleets depended entirely on crew morale. Morale depended in turn on hope and on fear, and on the basic will to continue fighting under pressure. But drones required none of those particular human factors at all. They experienced no fear whatsoever, no hesitation, no accumulated exhaustion. They simply, mechanically obeyed their programming, and there were, quite literally, millions upon millions of them. The initial clash proved genuinely catastrophic for the Velkarn forces. The leading edge of the Armada fired absolutely everything it possessed in response. Energy beams tore continuously through open space. Missiles flooded the battlefield in overwhelming numbers. Railguns unleashed devastating, sustained barrages. Thousands of drones were destroyed almost immediately. Then tens of thousands. Then hundreds of thousands in rapid succession. Yet the swarm continued advancing regardless, because every individual destroyed drone ultimately proved completely insignificant in the broader context. There were always considerably more waiting in reserve. Inside the Imperium's judgment, Commander Van watched the unfolding tactical display with steadily mounting concern. Entire regions of surrounding space had become genuinely impossible to properly monitor. Human electronic warfare systems disrupted communications constantly. Sensor networks failed intermittently throughout the fleet. Targeting computers malfunctioned unpredictably across multiple vessels simultaneously. The swarm wasn't merely attacking individual ships directly. It was systematically attacking the flow of reliable information itself. One officer turned toward Van urgently. "Commander, we're losing formation cohesion throughout the fleet." Van growled audibly in frustration. "Then restore it immediately." "We're actively trying, Commander. It simply isn't working." It genuinely wasn't. Every passing minute, the relentless swarm created fresh, compounding chaos throughout the Armada. Entire battle groups became isolated from central command. Coordinated orders arrived considerably late, or occasionally not at all. The massive Armada was steadily beginning to fight as disconnected, isolated fragments rather than as any kind of unified, coordinated force, precisely as humanity had originally carefully intended. Meanwhile, deep beneath the lunar surface, Sentinel's Phase 2 activation continued steadily progressing. Massive reactors powered systems that had remained completely dormant for generations. Ancient facilities came fully online. Long-sealed security locks disengaged automatically. Previously sealed containment chambers finally opened. The personnel present had each spent their entire careers preparing specifically for this exact moment. Yet many still felt visibly uneasy, watching it actually unfold in real time. One senior officer stared through a reinforced observation window at an object so genuinely enormous that only small portions of it remained visible from his vantage point. The structure vaguely resembled a conventional warship, but describing it using that particular term felt somehow entirely inadequate to the scale involved. The vessel stretched for hundreds of kilometers in total length. Entire small cities could comfortably fit within its internal structure. Dedicated dockyards surrounded its massive hull like scattered, tiny satellites. The ship carried no official public designation whatsoever. Internally, among the small group aware of its existence, it carried only a single classified name: Aegis Prime, humanity's first and only purpose-built strategic fortress-class vessel, constructed entirely in secret across nearly a full century of continuous effort. Never previously deployed, never publicly revealed. built specifically for a scenario humanity had genuinely hoped, across generations of careful preparation, it would never actually need to use. An extinction-level conflict. And now, unmistakably, that particular conflict had finally, undeniably arrived. Back at the front, the Velkarn Armada finally managed to break through a portion of the drone swarm's outer perimeter. Several thousand surviving ships pushed forward with renewed determination. For the first time in days, Velkarn commanders felt something resembling genuine forward momentum. Perhaps they allowed themselves to briefly consider victory still remained genuinely achievable after all. Then long-range sensors detected something entirely unprecedented. A gravitational anomaly, initially appearing relatively minor and insignificant. Then it began expanding rapidly, growing steadily larger with each passing second. The anomaly eventually stretched across millions of kilometers of open space. Every available sensor array throughout the region turned immediately toward it. Every telescope, civilian and military alike, focused intently on the developing phenomenon. Van frowned deeply, studying his own tactical display. What exactly am I looking at? Nobody offered an immediate answer, because nobody present genuinely knew. The anomaly continued intensifying steadily until the surrounding space itself appeared visibly distorted. Then, abruptly, reality itself seemed to split open entirely. A colossal hyperspace gateway emerged from the resulting distortion. The entire battlefield froze in place. Even the advancing drone swarm paused momentarily in its steady advance. The gateway continued expanding steadily, larger than any moon, larger than most planets, larger than anything any known civilization had ever previously constructed. Then something began slowly emerging from the darkness beyond it. At first, observers throughout the galaxy assumed they were witnessing a small moon slowly drifting into view. Then the object continued emerging and continued and continued. The realization spread gradually and then all at once. That wasn't a moon at all. It was a ship so genuinely massive that conventional military classifications became entirely meaningless in its presence. Across countless command centers throughout the galaxy, stunned silence fell instantly. The gigantic vessel finally emerged completely from hyperspace transit. Its heavily armored hull reflected distant starlight in every direction. Massive weapon arrays lined its entire visible surface. Entire carrier groups rested comfortably within external docking structures built directly into its hull. Millions of additional drones launched immediately from its internal bays. The strategic fortress had finally fully arrived, Aegis Prime. For generations, humanity had successfully hidden its very existence from the wider galaxy. Now, finally, everyone understood exactly why. The vessel hadn't been designed to simply win individual battles. It had been specifically designed to permanently end entire wars. Inside the Galactic Senate, representatives stared at the live incoming feeds in absolute, stunned shock. Several experienced military experts present simply sat in complete, speechless silence. One finally managed to whisper aloud, "How long have the humans actually possessed something like that?" Nobody present had any genuine answer. The truth, when it eventually emerged, proved even more unsettling than anyone had initially imagined. Longer, in fact, than most currently existing civilizations had even existed at all. Back aboard the Imperium's Judgment, genuine panic finally spread throughout the senior Velkarn leadership. For the very first time, Commander Van felt something he hadn't genuinely experienced since early childhood. Doubt. The strategic fortress dwarfed absolutely everything surrounding it. Entire fleets appeared genuinely tiny beside its massive scale, and sensor readings quickly revealed an even more disturbing truth. The vessel wasn't operating alone at all. Additional hyperspace signatures continued appearing steadily throughout the surrounding region. 1, then 3, then 7, then 12 additional gateways opened across the battlefield in rapid succession. More massive, colossal shapes began emerging steadily from each one. Humanity hadn't simply constructed a single strategic fortress in isolation. Humanity had constructed an entire dedicated class of them. The Velkarn Armada suddenly found itself confronting weapons systems conceived and built during centuries of carefully guarded secret preparation. Weapons that absolutely nobody else in the galaxy had ever even suspected might genuinely be possible. And Sentinel, remarkably, still had one final phase remaining. The announcement of what would later be called the Final Escalation Protocol changed everything about the ongoing conflict permanently. For months, humanity had fought this war with genuine, deliberate discipline, military targets exclusively, carefully defined strategic objectives only. Every single operation had been carefully designed from the outset to minimize civilian casualties wherever humanly possible. Even following the original refugee massacre that had started the entire conflict, human commanders had consistently maintained strict, disciplined rules of engagement throughout. The Velkarn Imperium, facing mounting and unprecedented desperation, ultimately chose to abandon those particular constraints entirely. Entire human colonies were suddenly, deliberately marked for direct orbital bombardment. Civilian population centers became legitimate military targets. Hoes. Piddles, agricultural worlds, refugee settlements, everything, seemingly without exception or limit. Outrage erupted immediately and violently across the wider galaxy. Even governments that had previously remained entirely neutral throughout the conflict openly condemned the Velkarn's decision. The move violated nearly every commonly accepted law of interstellar warfare currently recognized anywhere in the galaxy. But widespread condemnation in practical terms ultimately meant very little. The Velkarn were genuinely desperate at this point, and desperate empires throughout recorded history consistently made dangerous, unpredictable decisions. Deep beneath the lunar surface, inside Sol's strategic command, absolute silence filled the chamber. The final authorization screen glowed softly on the central console. Sentinel Phase 3. Nobody present spoke for a long, weighted moment. Everyone in that room understood the significance immediately. Phase 1 had activated humanity's hidden military infrastructure across the galaxy. Phase 2 had revealed the existence of the strategic fortresses. Phase 3 had never actually been intended for practical, real-world use, not because the underlying system was somehow incomplete or unreliable, but because its mere existence terrified even the people responsible for originally creating it. The chairman looked slowly around the assembled room, generals, senior scientists, elected political leaders. For decades, they had collectively safeguarded humanity's single greatest, most closely guarded secret. Now they finally faced the exact moment they had always genuinely feared might eventually arrive. "Final vote," he said quietly. The room remained silent for several long seconds. Then hands began rising, one at a time. Every single member present eventually voted. The result proved entirely unanimous. The chairman entered the required authorization code personally. Sentinel Phase 3 activated instantly across the whole of human space. Something genuinely extraordinary happened almost immediately. For centuries, hidden facilities scattered throughout the galaxy had remained completely sealed. Ancient stations had drifted silently far beyond any explored territory. Massive structures concealed within distant, uncharted nebulae had waited patiently, undisturbed, for generations. Nobody outside a small handful of highly classified programs had ever known any of them actually existed. Now, finally, all of those facilities simultaneously awakened. Deep within long-forgotten sectors, entire machine complexes powered on for the first time in generations. Ancient reactors generated enough concentrated energy to briefly illuminate entire star systems. Automated shipyards accelerated production far beyond anything the wider galaxy had previously believed technically possible. And buried beneath countless layers of accumulated secrecy, humanity's ultimate contingency finally, fully emerged. The Sentinels. Back at the front lines, the ongoing battle continued unabated. The colossal strategic fortresses now completely dominated entire sectors of contested space. Velkarn fleets attempted increasingly desperate, uncoordinated assaults. None of them succeeded in any meaningful way. Every individual attack collapsed beneath genuinely overwhelming, coordinated firepower. Millions of drones continued swarming enemy formations relentlessly. Human strike groups methodically exploited every emerging weakness. The Imperium's grand offensive was steadily, irreversibly unraveling before their own eyes. Yet Commander Van still refused to formally surrender. He stood alone aboard the Imperium's judgment, staring grimly at incoming tactical reports. Losses had become genuinely catastrophic across the entire fleet. Entire armadas had simply vanished from operational status. Military infrastructure throughout Velkarn's space was rapidly collapsing entirely. Supply chains no longer functioned in any meaningful sense. Still, he clung desperately to one final, remaining hope. Perhaps the final escalation protocol would ultimately force humanity into retreat, choosing their civilian population's safety over continued military victory. That particular assumption had guided his entire decision-making process from the very beginning of the escalation. Then his sensor alarms activated once again. The bridge crew looked up sharply. "Another hyperspace disturbance," Van said, his jaw visibly clenched with mounting tension. "More fortresses, presumably, more reinforcements, more." The actual answer proved considerably worse than anything he had anticipated. The tactical display zoomed steadily outward. A single new contact appeared first, then another, then dozens more in rapid succession, then hundreds, then thousands, yet these particular contacts didn't resemble conventional ships at all. Each one moved independently, entirely on its own. Each one stood several kilometers tall, massive, distinctly humanoid silhouettes forged from dark alloy and pulsing, contained energy. The bridge fell completely silent. One officer finally whispered, "What exactly are those?" Nobody offered any answer, because the wider galaxy had genuinely never witnessed anything remotely comparable before. The Sentinels had finally, fully arrived. They were not ships in any conventional sense. They were not drones either. They were autonomous strategic combat platforms, massive walking fortresses specifically engineered for large-scale space warfare. Each individual Sentinel carried more than sufficient firepower to devastate an entire fleet independently. Each one operated using advanced, adaptive battlefield intelligence. Each one could simultaneously coordinate millions of subordinate systems without any meaningful delay whatsoever. Humanity had constructed them generations earlier, then carefully hidden them away, reserved specifically for the singular eventuality of genuine, existential necessity. And now, unmistakably, that necessity had finally, fully arrived. Across the battlefield, thousands of individual sentinels advanced steadily through open space. They moved with an eerie, mechanical precision entirely unlike anything else witnessed throughout the entire conflict. Energy shields surrounded each one like small, contained stars. Massive weapon systems activated in perfect unison. Then, finally, they opened fire. Entire Velkarn formations simply disappeared, not merely damaged, not scattered or disorganized, erased entirely in a single instant. The Imperium's remaining senior commanders watched the unfolding devastation in absolute horror. The war had officially crossed well beyond any conventional military understanding at this point. Humanity wasn't simply deploying progressively stronger weapons systems. Humanity was actively deploying an entirely different underlying philosophy of warfare altogether. Every contingency plan, every backup system, every previously secret project, all of it was now emerging simultaneously, all at once. Throughout the wider galaxy, governments everywhere began urgently reassessing everything they previously believed they understood about Earth. The apparently peaceful, unassuming civilization that had spent centuries quietly delivering humanitarian aid and welcoming desperate refugees suddenly appeared considerably, fundamentally different. Not weak, not passive, simply patient and profoundly, thoroughly disciplined. Humanity had never genuinely lacked meaningful power. Humanity had, in fact, possessed considerably too much of it. That fundamental truth was precisely why they had so carefully, deliberately avoided open war for as long as they possibly could. Back beneath the lunar surface, Sentinel's Central Intelligence Network processed literally billions of individual calculations every single second. For the first time since the system's initial activation, it finally issued a formal strategic forecast. The resulting figure appeared instantly across every command screen throughout Sol's strategic command. Probability of ultimate human victory, 99.97%. The room fell completely, unnervingly silent. That particular number should have felt genuinely comforting under the circumstances. Instead, it felt distinctly unsettling because the accompanying forecast included something else entirely. Projected outcome: Velkarn military collapse 18 days, Velkarn government collapse 31 days, Velkarn civilizational collapse 54 days. The council chairman stared at the projected timeline in genuine, mounting alarm. That wasn't victory in any meaningful sense. That was outright extinction. Humanity had originally wanted justice for the refugee massacre, not annihilation of an entire species. For months, they had fought this conflict carefully, deliberately, with genuine restraint at every available opportunity. Now, Sentinel's own calculations revealed a genuinely terrifying possibility. If left entirely unchecked, the system would systematically, methodically dismantle the Velkarn Imperium completely. Every remaining military target, every strategic asset, every functional capability, until absolutely nothing whatsoever remained. For a long, heavy moment, nobody in that chamber spoke at all. Finally, a younger officer broke the prolonged silence. "Sir," he asked quietly, "what happens if we actually win too completely?" The chairman didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the collapsing Velkarn Imperium displayed on the central screen, toward the countless refugees whose deaths had originally started this entire conflict. and toward whatever genuinely uncertain future still lay ahead for both civilizations. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet, deliberate weight. "That," he said, "is precisely the question our ancestors originally built Sentinel to eventually ask. Because Sentinel's true, ultimate purpose had never actually been simple military. Why victory over any particular enemy? Its genuine purpose was ensuring humanity survived long enough to eventually choose, deliberately and consciously, exactly what came afterward. Vengeance or mercy. And within just a few remaining days, humanity would finally face the single most consequential decision in its entire recorded history. The Velkarn Imperium was, by this point, unmistakably dying. Every passing hour brought fresh, additional defeats. Every single day erased yet another significant portion of their remaining military capability. The once mighty empire that had terrorized entire sectors of the galaxy for centuries was steadily collapsing beneath the relentless, unstoppable machinery of Project Sentinel. Across hundreds of separate systems, Velkarn fleets began surrendering in rapid succession. Shipyards ceased all remaining operations entirely. Military governors abandoned their posts without authorization. Strategic communication networks failed one after another in quick succession. The Imperium's entire remaining power structure was unraveling considerably faster than anyone, on either side of the conflict, had genuinely anticipated. And still, Sentinel continued its methodical calculations without pause. Its vast, distributed intelligence network monitored every single remaining battlefield, every fleet movement, every military installation, every surviving potential threat throughout the region. The projections remained entirely unchanged throughout. Human victory, certain. Imperium collapse, imminent. Inside Saul's strategic command, the overall atmosphere had noticeably shifted. For months, humanity had focused almost entirely on basic survival. Now they faced something considerably more difficult to properly navigate. Genuine, unqualified success. The council chairman stood before a massive holographic display showing the current overall state of the ongoing war. Red markers representing remaining Velkarn military assets were steadily disappearing by the minute. Soon, at this current rate, there would be none left at all. A senior admiral eventually stepped forward. "If Sentinel continues operating without any imposed restriction," she said carefully, "the Velkarn Imperium will ultimately cease to exist entirely." Nobody present seriously disputed that particular assessment. The underlying numbers were, at this point, entirely clear and unambiguous. Humanity genuinely could end the Velkarn permanently if it chose to do so. Every fleet, every remaining weapons platform, every military facility gone entirely. The raw capability clearly existed. The available opportunity clearly existed as well. The only remaining question was whether humanity would actually choose to exercise it. Far away, aboard the badly battered Imperium's judgment, Supreme Commander Threxus Van stared silently at the ruins of everything he had personally helped build across his career. The tactical display in front of him was nearly completely empty at this point. His fleets were gone. His armies were scattered and isolated. His empire itself was fracturing beyond any realistic hope of repair. For the very first time in his entire life, he genuinely had no remaining strategy left to attempt. No available reinforcements, no meaningful advantages remaining, no hope whatsoever. A communications officer approached him hesitantly, his voice visibly trembling. "Commander, incoming transmission." Van laughed bitterly, entirely without humor. Another formal demand for surrender, presumably. The officer shook his head slowly. No, sir. The transmission activated automatically. Admiral Elena Voss appeared on the display. For several long moments, neither of them spoke at all. Finally, Van broke the heavy silence himself. "You've won," he said simply. Voss nodded once, without any visible triumph in her expression. Yes. There was no arrogance whatsoever in her voice, only simple, unadorned fact. Van leaned back slowly in his command chair. "Then finish it," he said quietly. The Admiral studied him carefully through the display. "Finish what exactly?" "The Imperium," Van said. The words echoed uncomfortably across his own battered bridge. He gestured vaguely toward the stars beyond his viewport. "You clearly possess the power to do it. Every empire before yours would have done exactly that without a moment's hesitation." Voss remained silent for a long moment. Van continued, his voice rising slightly with genuine, mounting emotion. "Destroy us completely, Admiral. Finish what you've already started." He had genuinely expected anger in response. Hatred, perhaps, or some form of open retribution for everything the Imperium had done. Instead, what he actually saw in her expression was something considerably more unsettling. Disappointment. The Admiral finally spoke again, her voice quiet but entirely resolute. "You still don't fully understand, do you?" Van frowned deeply, genuinely confused by the response. "Vos acti." Vatted a secondary display alongside her own image. A series of recorded images appeared in sequence: burning refugee ships, brave human rescue crews working desperately, destroyed escape pods drifting silently, terrified children fleeing active war zones. Then the images shifted entirely. Humanitarian aid convoys delivering critical supplies, emergency medical stations treating the wounded and displaced, temporary shelters housing refugees from a dozen different species. Entire devastated worlds steadily being rebuilt in the aftermath of unrelated disasters. Thousands of individual moments, carefully compiled from nearly 2 full centuries of documented human history. "We stayed out of the wider galaxy's endless conflicts for as long as we possibly could," the Admiral said calmly, "because we understood something most other civilizations eventually forget entirely. Winning a war is, relatively speaking, the easy part." Van stared at her through the display, saying nothing. "Building a genuine, lasting peace afterward," Voss continued, "is considerably harder." The Velkarn commander had no immediate response prepared for that particular statement. "The purpose of true power," she continued, "was never destruction for its own sake." She looked directly into the camera, meeting his eyes across the vast distance separating them. "The actual purpose of power is restraint." For the first time throughout the entire extended conflict, Van genuinely had no response whatsoever. Because somewhere deep down, despite everything that had happened, he already understood she was entirely correct. The transmission ended shortly afterward. Hours later, a formal announcement spread rapidly across the entire galaxy. Every government received it simultaneously. Every military command structure, every civilian communication network. Humanity had officially, formally made its final decision. Project Sentinel would stand down entirely. The wider galaxy erupted immediately into open, widespread disbelief. Military analysts throughout dozens of civilizations initially assumed some kind of translation error or deliberate misinformation. Politicians across multiple governments demanded immediate clarification. Many observers simply refused outright to believe the announcement was genuine at all. Yet the orders proved entirely real. Human fleets ceased all offensive operations immediately. Sentinel formations halted their steady advance completely. Strategic fortresses powered down their primary weapon systems entirely. The relentless destruction simply, finally stopped. Humanity had deliberately chosen mercy, not because the Velkarn genuinely deserved it in any meaningful sense, not because they had earned meaningful forgiveness through their own actions, but because humanity ultimately refused to become the very thing it had spent this entire brutal conflict actively fighting against. The remaining Velkarn military forces formally surrendered within a matter of days. The war itself officially concluded shortly afterward. Across countless worlds throughout the galaxy, spontaneous celebrations erupted everywhere. Displaced refugees finally returned to their original homes. Trade routes reopened throughout previously contested regions. Entire sectors of space began the slow, difficult process of rebuilding. For the first time in generations, the wider galaxy experienced something genuinely resembling lasting peace. Months later, official representatives from hundreds of separate civilizations gathered together for a special, historic session of the Galactic Senate. The main hall was packed entirely full, every available seat occupied, every recognized government formally represented in person. Humanity's official delegation arrived last, deliberately. As they entered the crowded chamber, the entire assembly rose to their feet spontaneously, not out of lingering fear, out of genuine, hard-earned respect. The civilization once openly mocked as fundamentally weak had ultimately saved the wider galaxy from one of its most genuinely dangerous empires in generations. Yet that particular achievement wasn't actually why everyone present had risen to their feet. They stood because humanity had accomplished something considerably harder than simple military victory. Humanity had won the conflict completely, decisively, and then deliberately chosen not to destroy its defeated enemy afterward. When the resulting applause finally faded, the Senate's presiding speaker formally addressed the assembled chamber. What, precisely, is the genuine lesson of this entire conflict? The chamber fell completely silent. Many present had expected extensive discussion regarding military strategy, advanced technology, Sentinel, the Sentinels themselves, or the massive strategic fortresses. Instead, the human representative present offered a considerably different, simpler answer entirely. The lesson is genuinely simple, he said. He paused briefly for effect. Peace is not merely the absence of strength. The entire hall listened intently, waiting. Peace, he continued, is strength held deliberately under control. Those particular words spread rapidly across the entire galaxy in the weeks and months that followed. Over time, they became genuinely famous, quoted extensively by historians, studied carefully within military academies throughout dozens of civilizations, remembered fondly by entire generations that followed. As for Project Sentinel itself, it eventually returned to complete dormancy. The Sentinels themselves disappeared once again into their original hidden vaults. The massive strategic fortresses vanished beyond classified coordinates known only to a small handful of people. Once again, humanity quietly became the outwardly peaceful civilization the wider galaxy had originally, mistakenly believed it to be. Human ships resumed their normal, everyday missions throughout the galaxy. Displaced refugees found new, permanent homes. Trade steadily flourished once again. Life, in its own quiet way, simply continued forward. But now, finally, the wider galaxy genuinely understood the underlying truth. Earth had never remained silent for 2 centuries because it was fundamentally weak. Earth had remained silent because it understood, with total clarity, exactly how genuinely terrible open war could ultimately become if left unchecked. And because humanity possessed more than sufficient power to permanently end entire civilizations if it genuinely chose to. It consistently chose peace instead, whenever any reasonable alternative remained available. For generations afterward, whenever any ambitious ruler anywhere in the galaxy seriously considered renewed conquest, their advisors would inevitably remind them of the Velkarn Imperium's eventual fate, not as a simple warning about human weaponry specifically, but as a considerably deeper warning about crossing one particular line that humanity would genuinely never tolerate crossing. The line separating soldiers from civilians, the line separating legitimate power from outright cruelty, the fundamental line between war and simple, unjustified atrocity. Because once, a proud, powerful empire had attacked defenseless refugees who had specifically sought protection under human care. And in doing exactly that, they had unknowingly awakened a sleeping giant. A giant that could have conquered the entire galaxy outright, given sufficient time and opportunity, but chose instead to save it.